Hello. Hello, everybody. Very nice to see you. Before I start presentation, quickly introduce myself. I'm Uliana Shchelgacheva. I'm a founder of Phronetic, a behavioral consultancy, and I'm also a co-founder of Longevity Hub, which is a company that is trying to help aging population with their behaviors. So I'm basically a fan of behaviors. So today what I'll talk to you about, my topic is designing for silver economy. How do we ensure that things we design empower and not exploit the aging population? Why do I want to talk about this? I'm not designer actually, so I will not give you tips about design, but I am a behavioral scientist. And what I am fascinated about is actually the idea that the context in which we find ourselves, like for example right now, can actually very much influence our behavior, but further, it can actually even influence our well-being, our happiness. So imagine if you could apply that idea to the population that is aging. Then I think you have a huge ground of opportunities to work with, right? To not only help that population, but also reap the benefits, being your business or, get some ideas. So to start my presentation, I wanted to actually interact a bit with you guys and ask you, when you see this picture, or when in general you think about a person, a senior, an older person, what thoughts come to your mind? Anybody would like to maybe throw a few ideas? What 3 words come to your mind? I'm sorry? Discussion. Yes. What else? Experience. Yes. Thank you. Basically, what we have found out that people who are, let's say, in their middle ages, my age or younger, when you look at an older person, normally we're actually very much prone to ageism. We try to judge, the things that almost subconsciously might come to our mind are things like, they might be in cognitive decline, maybe they're not so fast, they might be thinking slower, things like that, right? We, as part of the project that we're working on in Longevity Hub, we've actually conducted interviews with numerous future retirees and also recent retirees, trying to understand what are the things that are important to them. And we were actually very inspired to see the things that they talk about themselves, but also what really matters to them. And the things that matter to them is actually social interactions. That is something that, they talk a lot. In fact, they have barriers once you retire, to interact with people. They talk about, passing the knowledge, finding ways to basically try somehow to continue interact with the world, sharing their knowledge, doing the things that they like. But I think what stands out to me is really this, central theme, which is being needed. Yeah, this is something that most of the people that we've interviewed spoke about. This is really something that they care about. And if you think about, as a designer, how do you design services or products around that need, being needed? How do you make them feel needed? This is what we will talk about. But I also, before I go further, I wanted to say that, in fact, between what I've said before, how we look at, retirees or people who are above the age of 55, and what matters to the retirees, there seems to be a gap, and that's what I want to really focus today about. In fact, it's really, we could say it's a misunderstood demographic, misunderstood from many ways, not only from how we look at them, but also, how basically the world runs around them. And here are a few misconceptions that we have identified, but the studies, numerous studies, actually suggest that they might not be true. So one of them is that older people are not interested in the outside world. They've lived their life, they want to chill, they're not interested already, in learning new things. And what we have discovered, and not we actually, there are a lot of studies about that, is that actually learning more, being active part of the learning process increases their cognitive capacities. Now think about it. That could mean that if we change our assumption that they're not interested and instead providing them in many different ways, think maybe of creative ways, how can we provide to them more learning opportunities? We could not only help them, that's a business idea in its own, right? Another thing that these people don't care about close relationships. This is a huge misconception. And our interviews have showed it, but also research shows that, in fact, they really care very much about creating meaningful relationships. You've seen that word being needed, right? This is something that they really, really care about it. And they have a lot of barriers because, especially with the move to retirement, their social networks change, right? So there's a big opportunity there. I'm not going to go through all of these misconceptions. But I think the few others that I would like to mention is really about the bad habits, right? That oftentimes you say, well, you've lived for so long, you have your habits that are all ingrained, you will not change. You were a smoker, you will die a smoker, right? What a lot of studies finding out, actually, is that from behavioral standpoint, because they have resilience and more like mental toughness, these people are actually more likely to change their habits than the younger ones. So again, this might be an opportunity, to help people to live healthier lives. These people might be prone actually more to change, behavioral change. Some interesting marketing insights, for example, that they don't care about intimacy and sex. Some people say, old, right? Do they even whatever, right? Well, apparently, obviously, it depends on culture, on countries, etc. But some studies suggest that up to 40% of people above 60 years old are actually sexually active. And what they care about is not just sex, but they care about forming meaningful relationships, meaningful connections. Again, it really comes to that. I think now you kind of see the red thread, right, in my narrative, creating some kind of meaningful experience for these people. This is what matters really to them. So then the big question is, how do we as a society become more inclusive? How do we design the world? Do we even care about solving these kind of problems? I would say yes, because World Bank, for example, predicts that by the year 2050, people who are older than 60 years old will constitute roughly 22% of the global population. Now think about it. Maybe 22%, okay, is just an ambiguous number, but that means, maybe next time we meet, every fifth person here would be actually above 60 years old. That means we should be probably really switching our narratives in the services that we design, in the things we design, but also how do we think about population? How do we even call them, right? And this is what I'm going to talk about. And I believe, as I've mentioned already, that especially for you guys in the field of design, asking yourself about this question, trying to move that paradigm of, thinking about older people just old and useless, is not only a huge opportunity, but I think for you as designers, it's actually a responsibility. As Robert Peters, a famous designer, said, design creates culture, culture shapes values, values determine the future. Yes, so in fact, many things might start with the things that you guys are thinking about designing. And now I would like to actually propose a few ways how you as designers could actually, think more about how do you actually empower aging populations. What I will talk is about debiasing our misconceptions. Debiasing, I'll explain you what it means, but basically we'll talk about a little bit how, I've mentioned to you before the misconceptions that we had, what do we do with them in order to have basically, be more inclusive, right? Be mindful of sludge. I'll explain what's sludge, bear with me, and thinking really setting objectives in terms of behavioral outcomes. So when I talk about debiasing our possible misconceptions, I've listed a couple of minutes ago some of the misconceptions that our society sort of manifests and thinks about the aging population. Some of them are true, some of them are our judgments. These are actually basics of sort of decision-making science. If you guys are interested after this talk, when there is a pause, I'm happy to talk to you more because there are approaches actually how we could do it. But basically recognizing the judgments that we make when we think about a particular demographic, in this case, older people, what assumptions do we make? Yeah, our judgments are basically assumptions or stories that we tell ourselves about, a particular problem, could be a particular task. In this case, I'm speaking about really the people who are 60 years older. What stories are we telling about them, right? Are they really in cognitive decline? Are they really that slow? Do they really not care about the things that the modern world seems to care? Yeah? And so those are judgments. And one thing about judgments, though, is that oftentimes our judgments could be subconscious. So let's say as me, as an individual, because I have seen certain experiences, I might be speaking and in my narrative not recognizing these judgments. So one suggestion would be really that you as designers work in teams and learn to spot those judgments by asking questions, right? What story are you telling? Are you assuming that? Or are you assuming this thing, right? And also then, are any of these judgments biased? Do you understand what I mean by being biased? Biased means that are we thinking in a particular way about a certain topic, or in this case, about the people who are 60 years old or more? Is there any common theme about the within the judgments that we have, right? Are we really, I don't know, we don't care, right? Do we not really care about this demographic? Or do we think that they don't care about particular goods or services that we design? Really, trying to challenge and asking not only yourselves, but like I said, encouraging actually team interactions and spotting biases in each other. What I also want to talk to you about is the concept of sludge. I don't know, maybe by a show of hands, before I get into the details, does anybody know in these, probably you guys are designers, heard about the term nudge? By the show of hands? No? Okay, some heard, that's great. I will quickly explain you. So there's a concept, I would say one of the central concepts in behavioral science that is called nudge, that I've told you at the beginning of my presentation. More and more studies show that we are creatures of context. We are influenced by context. So nudging people means that we're not informing them about how they should behave, but rather we create a context that makes it easier for people to make a particular choice, to display a particular behavior. For example, I don't know, some examples that are relevant to retirees, helping people to save more for their retirement. One of the problems is that people sometimes don't save enough for their retirement. So what could you do to make it easier for them to do? And there are a lot of behavioral science interventions that, for example, by default actually do certain contributions so that people don't even have to think about it until they get to retirement and they realize, oh, actually I have saved up enough. So that is nudge. Nudge, normally the central theme of nudge is that it is intended to help people make better choices in their long-term interest. Sludge is the opposite of nudge. Actually, the literal translation or meaning of sludge is a viscous liquid, mud, a byproduct of refining this kind of, mud. And behavioral scientists actually used this term to describe the opposite, when you actually create processes or services that impact behavior, not in the people's best way. I give you some example here. There are too many steps to complete a particular application, right, to sign up. Probably a very good example of sludge is that, and probably we all have been prone to it. You register for some app or for some service, it's very easy to register, right? But then at some point you realize, I actually don't need it. It's very difficult to unsubscribe oftentimes, right? So sludge is actually the difficulty for you to unsubscribe to the thing that you don't. Oftentimes sludge is embedded. We're all sort of exposed to that. Oftentimes sludge is embedded unintentionally, but many times sludge is actually embedded intentionally, like in that process when companies try to maximize their profits, right? Or maximize the number of users that they have. So examples are, like I said, too many steps or roadblocks. For example, you've probably been to an administrative process, I don't know, getting your ID card or whatever, right? And oftentimes there are so many steps to complete before you get to that point. That is sludge, and that is a huge opportunity, to improve processes. Excessive waiting times, especially think about retirees, right? That sometimes they have to wait or, in lines, etc. Waiting times is sludge. Providing information repeatedly, right? Also, on one hand, it's sludge, on the other hand, it's opportunity. Misusing the information, I think this one is big nowadays, especially for people who are aging, especially, like their health data, for example, So what can we do then with sludge if we know that it is part of basically anything that we design? So we can actually conduct audits, of the processes, of the products that we have, and ask ourselves, are we not embedding some sludge in the things that we have designed, right? Are we actually doing things in the user's best interest? Is it impacting their behavior in the way that it is intended to be? Are the users actually, getting what they would expect? But what we can also do, we could actually use sludge strategically and also for their greater good. For example, preventing impulsive decisions. As I've mentioned to you, for retirees, for example, what we are discovering is that many retirees make impulsive decisions about going to retire. They might be tired of work, and oftentimes they don't consider, for example, if they have enough savings, if they thought about what they're going to do, they just say, you know what, I'm tired, I retire. Could we embed some sludge into that process so that that actually encourages people to think about more? Maybe to find out, how are they even going to have enough to survive during their retirement, So sludge could also be used strategically in that case. Also, for example, to caution risky behavior, right? When we think about if we're trying to design some kind of, physical environment, right? We could put some sludge, especially, I don't know what you guys designed, but, you could think of maybe putting some sludge in to discourage risky behavior. Also, warn of unintended circumstances. I think a good example of that is actually data protection laws, right? That warn us, you're about to submit certain data. That is sludge that is intended actually to protect people's privacy, right? So this is kind of the thought that I want to leave you with, is that, when you think about designing anything for the people who are older, knowing that, they're sort of more vulnerable, particularly, right, in digital designs, really thinking about what kind of sludge are we embedding, and if that sludge is really necessary and serving to their greater good. And also what I'm thinking about here is that, with example, to warn people, for example, of unintended consequences, is that, nowadays we live in the digital world, right? There's a lot about data. We gather data, we use it or misuse it. How do we design these data gathering processes so that they actually make people, happy to share it rather than abusing the data or sort of like asking them about it repeatedly. And last point is really thinking about behavioral outcomes. I am not a designer, but I've been around a few, and what I think probably many of you would agree is that when we design things, I don't know, be it whatever, a service, or maybe even when you have any idea, right, that you want to kind of put together, often what we think about is like, okay, it's going to have this feature that allow the user to achieve that. I would like to challenge you here. I mean, that is really great, right? We talk about what problems our designs, our ideas will solve, but I would like to actually leave you with the questions, what would I like to ensure the older people or my users, right, the older people actually behave like. Yeah? For example, if I would like to make sure that people are happy to share their personal data instead of I will gather their personal data, I believe, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've seen this actually in some real-life examples, is that when you ask yourself a question like that, right, that the behavioral outcome that I'm thinking that I want people to be happy to share their personal data, you might come up with a completely different solution rather than just saying, we will gather this, and this data. Yeah? And so that's first question. And the second question is really, what are the key elements of my design that would empower that behavior, right? So really think about these questions and think about, in addition, I'm not saying that, thinking about the futures of your product, etc., is not important. All I'm saying is that in addition to thinking about, the problems that your idea will solve, think also about how it influences behavior, and not only how it will influence, what would the behavioral outcome actually look like? So, and I'm just gonna maybe throw some thoughts, because as I've mentioned to you, there seems to be, in the narratives that I've showed you, if our society is moving towards 22% of global population being over the age of 60, probably there is a big shift of paradigm about how we think about these people, what we design for them, and how we design for them, So I would really like to, leave you with a few sort of ideas how to shift that paradigm, right? So one is combat ageism, make him feel young. This is a behavioral outcome. Imagine you designing something and you would say, we're designing an app that would help, I don't know, older people date, right? I don't know. Make them feel young. Wouldn't you bring an extra value with that, right? Do not segregate. Don't think about older people as, this demographic that has basically its own life. I actually have an example here. How far this sort of segregation can go. I have a 6-year-old daughter who recently got a photo camera, for her birthday, and she met my neighbor in the park, and she decided to take a picture of him, but she asked permission and said, "Can I take a picture of you in case you die?" So it's just to demonstrate, how ingrained, this ageism is really, in the society, and again demonstrate how unconscious it could be that even little kids, think this way. Also capitalize on their knowledge, wisdom, and mental strengths. Yeah, this is something I believe within workplace, for example, a huge unexplored opportunity. Companies haven't discovered ways to do it yet. Yes, studies show that they have a lot of wisdom, they want to share, and oftentimes actually that wisdom or that knowledge is something that is not that easily replaced by technology. So, think of those ideas. Encourage active aging. Yeah. Encourage things that, make people move, right? Don't assume that they don't want to move. They actually don't mind, yeah? And help meaningful relationships. As I've told you, being needed is a big theme that seems to be emerging. And if somebody figures out a way to help the aging population, not just create a relationship, not just another Tinder, but, find meaning in the relationships, this is when you probably will solve one of the key, really, issues. And first and foremost, to shift the paradigm, right? Maybe we should start calling things a different name. Instead of thinking about old people, aging, elderly, grandma, grandpa, I'm not sure what else. How about, a few terms that I throw you here? Prime timers, teenagers, just old enough, forever young, young at heart. What else? Maybe, I don't know, you guys are creative people. Maybe, you get some more ideas that might come to your head, right? And lastly but not least, I think what I want to leave you with this quote of Mark Twain that says, "Age is an issue of mind over matter. If you don't mind, it doesn't matter." Yeah? And it sounds like a lot of Asian people don't mind to be an active part of the society. They don't mind to create relationship. They don't mind to contribute to relationship. Actually, maybe one last thought that I wanted to leave you with is that yesterday I had a conversation with somebody in his early 70s, living actually very active life, you know, very, I would say ideal, right? Running marathons, mentoring startups. And when I asked him, I said, you know, when I asked him, what is it that you would still like to do or, you know, change? And he said, I would like to feel as I am 26 years old. Now think about it. He realizes, right, that he's 72, but he wants to feel as he's 26. That is why I think on you designers, there is not only a huge opportunity, but a big responsibility to think about, you know, how the elderly want to feel. Thank you. Sure.
Some questions to you.
Sure.
So maybe the first one from the internet. What does it mean to make them feel young? Is young at heart? It does not suggest young is better than old.
Aha, very interesting philosophical question. You know, when we were conducting interviews, I think making them feel young is actually that sort of emotional thrill, right? People at that age, they seem to realize and accept, you know, how old they are and what. But feeling young is really about having that kind of emotional thrill, right? Excitement. And that brings me again to the point that somehow we seem to discount that demographic. Whereas, you know, being active part of life and having opportunities to contribute in meaningful ways, that is something that would make them feel young.
Okay, maybe one question from our audience here. You have to raise your hand up because I cannot see. But okay. In the meantime, I read one question from our online audience. So, how to stay conscious of and self-monitor our own biases and stay educated if this is not a type of user we are in contact with in everyday life?
Yes, very important questions. And very, very smart question. So most of our biases are actually unconscious. We don't realize, right? So the best way to go around them actually is to, so first of all, already if you ask this question, that means you're sort of more mindful about that, right? So just knowing the fact that your biases are unconscious might, you know, sort of spark those questions once you're thinking about something, am I not biased? But the best way is actually to get yourself, you know, some kind of a buddy who would question you, you know, really somebody who is impartial enough but close enough to know you, over whom you would think your idea, and you could basically just discuss, and that person's, you know, only task, I would say, is really think about, like, okay, you know, what are you telling? What are you assuming? Really challenge you with these kind of questions. And it's true that if you don't really, you know, back to the demographic, it's true that if you're not really exposed to that kind of demographic, well, get exposed, what else can I say? If you're interested in learning about the people, you know, spend some days with them, chat with them, ask about their problems, challenges. They might tell you some fascinating stories. Yeah.